Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, students and friends, welcome to the kickoff of the high-level transatlantic lecture series that the America-Europe Fund and the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven have launched for the spring of 2021. As director of the Leuven Center and as administrator of the fund, I feel particularly honored that I have been asked to introduce and moderate this first lecture, which is titled Bound to Lead, Which Priorities and Opportunities for US-EU Relations. Please allow me to first say something about the new America-Europe Fund at KU Leuven. While much of the world was holding its breath for the American elections, we were able to set up in October last year the America-Europe Fund at KU Leuven, and we are immensely proud of this initiative. Why has the fund been created? Because Europe and America seem to be driving apart, and we want to do something about it. Now, seem to be driving apart, I should immediately add that experience has taught many of us, diplomats, business people, academics, experts in think tanks, officials, that the differences between America and Europe are perhaps less outspoken than those which we see between the member states of the European Union itself or between the American states themselves. And yet, in recent years, we seem to be focusing almost exclusively on the so-called widening gap between us. And that is something which we want to tackle with the America-Europe Fund. The overall aim of the fund is to contribute to a better comparative understanding and knowledge of, and of course also to stronger mutual relations between the United States and the European Union. The European Union, including also Belgium as the center, if I may say so, of the European institutions and of NATO, and with a long-standing tradition of hosting American headquarters and business headquarters in Europe. To this end, the America-Europe Fund promotes academic cooperation, exchanges, programs, and research at KU Leuven aimed at strengthening comparative, and I really stress the notion comparative knowledge of American and European societies. That's how we want to initiate and deepen cooperation and exchanges between the EU, the US, Belgium and its regions in the whole field of education, science, business, culture, diplomacy and policy making. So in that way, the America-Europe Fund also supports the clear strategic choice and the substantially increased internationalization aspirations of our university, KU Leuven, vis-à-vis North America, and also by encouraging the exchanges of students, of researchers, professors, and experts, in addition to the existing mechanisms for scholarship and cooperation. Now let me come to today's kickoff of our new transatlantic lecture series, which will more or less bring a lecture every 2 weeks. I can already tell you that in exactly 2 weeks' time from now, on Tuesday, the 23rd of March, we will have our next high-level lecture on trade issues. What is the concept of this lecture series? It is fundamentally one of dialogue and conversation between every time a distinguished American speaker and a distinguished European speaker, to see how both sides look at important challenges in the areas of trade, in the area of security, in areas of environment, just name it. Important challenges that we know require international cooperation and where we hope to find common ground, or where we also hope that if there are differences, we can better start to understand those differences and deepen our insight in what the other side is thinking. The lecture series is deliberately called The United States and the European Union, a New Momentum? Indeed, Joe Biden's election as President of the United States presents an opportunity to renew the transatlantic relationship after 4 rocky years. Now, of course, the US and Europe cannot simply go back and pick up again the thread where they had left it off when Mr. Biden, for instance, was vice president. But the idea of America and the idea of Europe remain relevant for the transatlantic relationship and for today's world. Notwithstanding the ups and downs in their historic relationship, we think there is sufficient enthusiasm today to look for a renewed common sense of purpose between partners of first resort. As we speak today, this is already happening. Politico Europe wrote today about a new beginning, quote unquote, indicating that a renewed transatlantic engagement is in the air. At the end of last week, as you may recall, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen spoke over the phone with US President Joe Biden, with a considerable détente in trade relations as an outcome. Commissioner Thierry Breton followed up with White House COVID coordinator Jeffrey Zients on vaccines on Monday. And that same day, US Vice President Kamala Harris spoke, of course, online in the European Parliament. So things are happening in a rapid pace. But there will surely be also many challenges, and that raises the crucial question on which we will focus also today, as to which priorities and which opportunities we should seize on in US-EU relations. Which challenges should be addressed first in foreign policy or at the domestic front? What are the real opportunities? What are the risks? What are the threats? We do have 2 excellent speakers for today's session. Dr. Andrea Kendall-Taylor, who is a senior fellow and director at the Washington-based Center for a New American Security. Welcome to our webinar, Andrea. And His Excellency Dirk Wouters, former ambassador to the United States and co-chair, and I should say co-creator, of the America-Europe Fund at KU Leuven. They will address these issues in dialogue, as I said, in a conversation mode. And I will be very happy to moderate, to the extent it is necessary at all, that conversation. After the initial conversation, I will also be very happy to take specific questions from you, which you can put in the Q&A box of GoToWebinar in order to have, let's say, really an interaction between you and our distinguished speakers. So let us really get started now. Well, first of all, I mentioned already in my introduction that there is something traditionally what we call the idea of America, but also the idea of Europe. And the question is, well, fine, is that idea of America, is that idea of Europe still relevant for today's and tomorrow's transatlantic relationship? So may I kindly invite Andrea maybe to first elaborate a little bit on the idea of America, and I'm sure Ambassador Dirk Wouters will be very happy to furthermore elaborate on the idea of Europe. But Andrea, you go first.
Great. Well, thank you, Jan, and it's really fantastic to be here. Ambassador, it's great to see you again. And you've started us off with, I think, an incredibly provocative question, Jan, but a really important one, clearly. And so that question about, is the idea of America still relevant for the transatlantic relationship? My answer would be a resounding yes, but I think there are some really important caveats and explanations that go along with that answer. And the first for me is that the idea of America is always a work in progress. It has never been a static thing. And I think here in the last 4 years, there were real questions about what the idea of America is, and importantly, whose America it is. And I think that was certainly a question that President Donald Trump campaigned on and that he won his election on. But there were also a number of other events and issues that brought that question about whose America is this to the forefront of American politics. And so we saw things here in the United States like the Black Lives Matter movement, We had our issues with immigration, and clearly the pandemic for us has also laid bare the inequalities that have defined the life for millions of Americans for a very long time. So the sense of America, I think right now, is highly contested. I would say more contested than at any point in my kind of political memory. And it's clear that the idea of America isn't just being contested here in the United States, but I think it's also being contested among foreign audiences. And I think we in Washington recognize very clearly that the idea of America has been tarnished in the eyes of many, especially amongst our European allies and partners. And so, but it's still relevant. The question of idea, is it relevant? Yes. But I think we also, as Americans, will now have a much greater sense of humility about what the idea of America represents. I think for a long time, we had thought of ourselves as this beacon of democracy. There was a preachiness, I think, that we can see in about how we talked about democracy and human rights with other countries. And I think it's painfully obvious now that we can no longer approach those types of issues in the same way. We recognize that the risk of authoritarianism and all of the threats to democracy isn't just happening somewhere over there. We see that it is here inside our own borders. We have disinformation. We know that polarization is at sky-high levels, and it's really straining and stressing our own institutions. So the idea of America is certainly relevant, but it's changing. And I think that then makes Americans stakeholders in this fight to defend democracy and our transatlantic way of life. So we aren't perfect. We've all seen that. But I think an important part now of what the idea of America is that we're not going to ignore the failures and shortcomings that we've seen over the last couple of years. We're not going to sweep them under the rug and pretend they don't exist. And this was something, if people haven't seen Tony Blinken's first foreign policy speech, he talked about this and embraced this idea that, the idea of America is one that confronts our challenges, and hopefully that other countries see in us their own challenges. And so, I think really an important part of this idea of America is, even though in the United States that we fall short of some of these ideals, we still hold these ideals and we aspire to them, and we're going to continue to fight for them and work towards them. And then that, I think the idea of America is very compelling. And then I think maybe just, two last quick points about this idea of America. It may be imperfect and it may be changing, but it's important to see too that it does still stand in very stark contrast to the idea of China and Russia and other authoritarian regimes that don't prioritize or hold the values that we do: democracy, pluralism, rule of law, separation of powers, free and open markets. All of those things are still very much central to the idea of America. We just have to be now stakeholders in the fight to uphold them. And I think as we saw in Tony Blinken's speech and in many of President Biden's early remarks, this is an administration that I think very much embraces the idea of America, but is looking to repair and renew what that idea is, and still, even with the flaws at home, is looking to actively engage in leadership on the world stage, because there still is this idea of America, I think that is a global leader, that is a stakeholder in the fight, and that if we step back, that it is not, other powers like the Russias and Chinas will step in to fill those voids, or that no one is going to step in and things, global challenges that we're all committed to fighting, then don't get taken care of, and that's not good for America. So I guess that's a long answer to say that it's a contested idea, more contested, but it's still, I think, extremely relevant, just in new and changing ways in the transatlantic relationship.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I think this was an excellent start for the conversation, because of course, as you can imagine, also in Europe, we have public opinion has gone through a certain evolution, and we have seen things happening. And indeed, in public opinion today, there are concerns about America's engagement in the world. And although we all applaud the arrival of the new administration, the big question, of course, for us is how long will the new engagement last? Will it just be for 4 years? Can we count on a continuation afterwards, and so on and so forth? But that's something which we can deepen a little bit later in the conversation. I now would like to ask Ambassador Dirk Wouters to share with us how he sees the idea of Europe. Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much. And it's great to be again in conversation with Andrea. I mean, we did this once during the Trump administration where we were together in a panel. And every day now I'm pinching myself, saying, isn't this great that after all these years we can do this again after we tried to hold the transatlantic relationship afloat, at least in our discussions during these difficult years. But I will try, to your question, Professor Wouters, I will try to give an as honest answer on the European idea as Andrea did on the American idea. And my answer will probably go in the same direction, and a yes, a resounding yes on the European idea and its relevancy for the transatlantic community, with some buts and certainly some encouragements as a conclusion to work even harder and improve the idea to make it fit for the modern world. But to start with some of the elements, I think that the idea, but also the decades-long march towards European integration remain relevant. The grand architecture, to start with, of that integration process in Europe, more or less remains intact. Let's start with the single market, which for a partner like the United States, the business world, and people who want to access it, is probably the best offer you can get from your partners in the business world, is the single market of the European Union. The single currency, which remains, I think, popular with the young people in Europe, necessary for our business, but without being a rival as a reserve currency at the moment for the dollar. The institutions, I mean, the European Parliament, where you can make legislation in cooperation with member states of the club, united in the Council of Ministers, with the European Commission, who has been empowered in a very broad set of policies to regulate, with the European Central Bank and the European Court of Justice, which are not identical to the Supreme Court or the Federal Reserve, but in their development, they come closer and closer, I think, to what the Supreme Court and the Federal Reserve are trying to do. So I think the grand architecture remains intact and relevant, and all this even today still expresses a kind of optimism about the potential for uniting a collectivity of people and countries in the world. And I think all in all, this integration process based on the European idea has worked. It has provided a measure of peace, which remains unmatched in our own European history. I think undisputed prosperity. And we were also allowed to propagate on our own continent in Europe the model. So think about Greece with the colonials, Spain after Franco, Portugal after Salazar. Think about German unification. So we were allowed to propagate this, and over a period of more than 60 years, I think, maybe in different ways, but this ambition and this project benefited from support by successive US administrations, which is an indication that it was also relevant on the other side of the Atlantic. And it was, of course, relevant, I think, in the first place, because it provided stability in a part of the world where the United States has been confronted historically with too much instability and too much nationalism. So from that point of view, stability certainly, it remains relevant, putting a democratic roof above the head of new countries that join the European Union, Central and Eastern Europe, without the roof of democracy put there by the Western Europeans. I think that would be in a much more difficult position today. But of course, it's not just about stability. We all know this. It's also about ideas and values, ideas that traveled from Europe to the United States during the Enlightenment period, ideas that are in the base integrated in our own European model, and that go back to ancient civilizations. I mean, the Greek one, the Roman one, and we can also add the Jewish Christian tradition. And I was, you see books behind me, and I was rereading last week the book by the Greek historian Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War, where there's still, I think, a very accurate definition and not too old definition of democracy. The idea that of equal rights, that power goes to the majority. They all go back to Athens and are still in our model. So I could speak about Alex de Tocqueville, a European who wrote a book which still today is a bestseller on American democracy, and an almost European, Henry Kissinger, who gave us such great insights in the balance of power in the history of Europe, in the works of diplomacy and China. So I think that, and we can go on, I mean, about these ideas, which are really important. When I think about the scientific world, what's the basis of science historically? It's the experiment. I think it's another contribution, the idea of experiment, like it is the idea of the soul. The soul is another European contribution, I think, to the Western civilization. And so we can go on with also in the chapter of ideas and also values, of course, that remain relevant, I think, to the transatlantic community. So my answer is yes, but there are buts. And the buts are, of course, that the whole promise by the European Union to its citizens of more security, more prosperity, more peace, more stability, it's true that this promise has been seriously affected by the series of crises we've witnessed, from the financial one, 2008, 2009, Russia aggression, populism, the Brexit, migration, you name it. And so, so this promise, I mean, it has really affected, I think, the maybe not the DNA of the European idea integration process, but in terms of providing sufficient output to address these type of crises that mattered to the ordinary people, maybe there we may have taken some damage, but this can only be an encouragement to do better. There's another thing another but that is, of course, that, and we know this as practitioners, and as think tankers and historians, academics, that national identities can be stubborn things, be it a difference in language, in let's say in history, differences in economic development. I mean, and during crisis, of course, these type of stubborn things come higher up front, come to the fore during these difficult periods of pressure. So encouragements to do better, a need to do better, and to make the institutions and the European Union fit for the modern world. And I think it's very important that every day those who are working there, and I have some experience myself, ask themselves the questions: are the solutions we are looking for in these, for the problems we address, are they really relevant to the people who care about the problem in our different countries in Europe? I think that's an important test, and we should try to continue to improve on the output also from that point of view. I'll stop there, Jan.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. This was really great. And I should maybe have mentioned that you have not just been ambassador to the United States until recently, but also that you were for quite a while also the permanent representative of Belgium to the European Union. And so that you know the European Union, especially in that period of upheaval and crisis, such as the financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis of the Eurozone, you know it very, very well. And so it's great that you were referring to all these achievements, but also to the challenges of that Europe stands for. It's definitely something on which we could elaborate and deepen the conversation. But I have a next question to ask to our two distinguished members here. And the question is actually to briefly maybe comment something on the historical relationship between America and Europe. Because of course, we have, as the ambassador already said, we have of course very, very strong historical ties. There has been massive migration also, not just of people, but also of ideas. The founders of the American Republic were deeply influenced by, let's say, the Enlightenment, by the ideas of that period. The very first, say, big promulgations of bills of human rights, and so on and so forth. It remains until today. You mentioned Alex de Tocqueville and Kissinger, but of course, for us Europeans, it remains very, very stimulating to read the Federalist Papers, to just give one example also about the thinking in the early years of the American Republic. So can we ask you maybe, and there I would like our Ambassador Dirk Wouters to go first, to say a bit in a historical perspective about the history between the United States and Europe. Ambassador.
Yes, yes, I'm glad. And as you say, we can, if you reflect upon that history, you can indeed go back far in history, but I will not do that except to say maybe that the motivation of those Europeans who went to the other side, at least the common motivation, I think, there were strong elements of the longing for a better life, new hopes, and so I think that we can remind, and secondly, as you said, some ideas have traveled to European, have traveled the other way. But I will start, or I prefer to start my comments with the two world wars that defined our last history, because we should never forget that after some very understandable hesitation, the United States came twice to the European continent. I mean, to help us out of a situation we couldn't solve ourselves, and especially the Second World War, it was clear that the United States has saved Europe from tyranny and dictatorship in such a way that we can only remain grateful. I mean, there's a notion of debt we should continue to acknowledge. But the United States could have, seen from a historical point of view, could have decided when the war was over just to go back to the United States, withdraw, retreat, as the history between Europe and the United States over the long period could be characterized as an alternating history of periods of course, cooperation, taking distance, and they could have taken distance again after the Second World War, and sometimes dissension, I mean, when we do not agree. I will come back to that. But historically, it's important to recognize that the United States stayed in Europe and stayed with a plan in Europe. There was not only a better plan for the management of the problems of the defeated country, in this case on the European continent, Germany, as there was a plan for Japan, but also there was what we sometimes call the Pax Americana, which was a plan to create a number of institutions at the world level, the United Nations. In the economic field, it was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, that became the World Trade Organization, and the objective at the beginning was to avoid the kind of protectionism that we have seen between the two world wars. There was, of course, the military alliance a bit later, NATO, very important, very strong commitment. And there were other institutions, the Bretton Woods, of course, in Washington, and so on. So there was this plan. I think that's important. And Europe tried to do its own part a bit later by creating this first European Community of Coal and Steel, and then European Economic Community, and so on until the European Union. But it did so with a lot of support of the United States. And for me, I could never forego, let's say, comments on the history of the relationship without mentioning the Marshall Plan, which for me remains probably the most brilliant analysis undertaken by one continent, the United States, on a situation in another continent and the needs at that time of that other continent, and followed by an action plan. So the Marshall Plan is something that for which Europe should always remain also grateful to the United States. I think that was a big one. But of course, the Pax Americana, most of that worked for Europe. I think it was not always easy, and there have been times where maybe we were not together when there were problems around the world. We were together, of course, when there was the situation in Korea, and it remains from several European countries, also for Belgium, the biggest military operation undertaking abroad in the history of military operations abroad. Vietnam, we were not together. I mean, then the Suez Canal crisis, you remember, we all know the history of Anthony Eden and the request to the United States to support him and help him, but there was a distance at the time, so that didn't happen. Of course, during the whole period of the Cold War, we stayed very closely together, very closely. Although maybe at the end of the Cold War, Europe and the United States may have drawn a bit different lessons in terms of the relationship with Russia, where I think for the United States, it was more a recognition at the end of the Cold War that this was really a defeat for Russia, where you had a bit more in Europe of, well, we still need a dialogue on certain issues with Russia. And so where there was even a Minister of Foreign Affairs in Belgium, Pierre Hermel, who then launched the Hermel Doctrine. And part of that was dialogue with Eastern Europe and with Russia. So, but during the Cold War, we worked together. And I will finish my historic remarks by saying also that on both sides also had their historic wake-up calls in post-war history. I think, but Andrea may intervene on that, that for the United States, it still was 9/11, a real wake-up call. So this terrorist attack, which then led to the intervention in Afghanistan, where we remained together, United States and Europe, together in, together out is still the motto. Then on Iraq, when there were differences, but also the terrorist attack led for, I think, the only time, the call upon Article 5 of NATO, when there was a complete unanimity, of course it was symbolic, on calling upon the solidarity clause of the Washington Treaty, with all Europeans supporting, of course. So I would say, in conclusion, I think it's a history of cooperation, being together, sometimes some distance, and sometimes some disagreement.
Thank you. So let's now immediately turn to Andrea to see to what extent she agrees, and from an American perspective, how she sees, let's say, the big historical currents under that relationship between America and Europe. Please, Andrea.
I will, and I agree wholeheartedly with what the ambassador just laid out. So I want to take it in a slightly different direction, in the sense that it is important to recognize, for so long, the rationale of the transatlantic relationship and of our cooperation has been the shared history and our shared values. And those two things, that history that Ambassador laid out so nicely, and the values, have really provided the foundation for the transatlantic relationship. And so I think looking forward, though, there is a concern, and this is one of the things, Ambassador, part of the point of us doing the Across the Pond project and going outside the Beltway, is that there is now, as time passes, a generation of Americans and also Europeans that didn't experience that history firsthand. And so there are concerns, I think, that the very strong foundation of the relationship might begin to weaken. And we also know that on both sides of the Atlantic, we have democracies that are facing challenges from within. And so the liberal democratic values that we've shared for so long are being tested and strained in new ways. So, first and foremost is to say we have to continue to look for opportunities to build this shared history together, and to maintain the people-to-people ties between both sides of the Atlantic, and also to be stakeholders and partners in this fight to recommit and defend our liberal values. But the one point I want to underscore is also to say that our cooperation is also based on more than just that shared history and those shared values. We also have mutual interests. And I think it's important. Sometimes I feel like in the transatlantic relationship, we fall back so much on this crutch of saying our shared history and our shared values provides a foundation for the relationship, that we don't talk enough about the mutual interests on both sides. And in many cases, the values and the history are intertwined with the interests. They're not entirely separate. The values, I think, are part of the shared interests. But there are so many interests that we have, and we don't talk about that as a foundation for the relationship in a way that we could. And so I know we're going to talk a little bit later, we'll talk about the China challenge, for example, something that the United States in particular is so focused on. And of course, in that dialogue, policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic will invoke our shared history and values as the reason and as the basis that we need to join forces and work together collectively to address China. But there is also this huge area of mutual interests. There's multiple dimensions of the relationship, thinking in the technology sphere, on trade, investment, and the democracy and human rights, where we have real mutual interests. And so maybe just a couple of examples. So for example, thinking about in the technology sphere, Beijing's actions do threaten to degrade US and European competitiveness in the technology sphere. Beijing is acquiring technology often illegally, which is then accelerating its ability to innovate. Their disregard for democratic norms threatens to accelerate digital authoritarianism, which we can see springing up in countries around the globe. All of those are real risks in areas where the United States and Europe have not just the shared values, but also these shared interests in tackling these challenges. In the investment realm, also, you can think about how the Chinese Communist Party is restricting access to China's markets, it's threatening supply chains, it's using its economic power to increase its influence, and those things can threaten EU and NATO cohesion. And so, we could go on and talk about all of these areas where I think there's not just the convergence of values in our history, but also a real overlap in pragmatic interests that I think it's also important to add to this debate and discussion in the transatlantic relationship, that we are an alliance not just of history and values, but also these shared interests. And one of the reasons, but again, not entirely separating them, because one of the reasons why we have such an overlap in interest is in part because of that shared history and our values. So again, I think the overarching point and what I just wanted to add to what Ambassador Wouters laid out is, history matters, but we also have these real pragmatic interests that should provide, as much justification for cooperating for greater transatlantic cooperation.
Thank you so much. And again, I am very happy to see how complementary your stories are in a certain way. So let me immediately, let's say, elaborate or ask you to elaborate on this by looking back at the past 4 years. Because indeed, you say we have common values, a shared history, we have common interests also. But in the past 4 years, it sometimes looked like there was not much in common anymore. It was a very rocky period for the transatlantic relationship. And the whole question, yes, was how did you experience that period? What lessons in a certain way can we learn from the past 4 years? Can I maybe ask Andrea to go first on this point?
Sure. And I mean, I think at the most general level, it was a really difficult 4 years for, I think, all members of the transatlantic community. I mean, just as a personal anecdote, before I joined the think tank community, I worked in the intelligence community for almost 10 years. And I will say, just from my own personal experience, it was really difficult working. So I didn't leave until 2018. And so it was very difficult to work and serve an administration that didn't have values that were consistent with mine. And that is to say, of course, that the intelligence community is an apolitical community. It's made up of career officers who serve at the discretion of whatever president is in power. That is what we are there to do. We check our political views at the door. But I would say, you know, the Trump administration really stressed that system in a way that I don't think it had previously been tested. And it was very a difficult period, even serving in that administration. And for all of the reasons I think that you've just said, I mean, we saw here a president for 4 years that called into question the United States commitment to NATO. We saw that this administration made a mess of the NATO summits, that, you know, he was consistently counterproductive in the way that he harped on and talked about burden sharing and the 2%. We all know that's important, but it was a terribly ineffective way to approach the issue. He called our European allies and partners foes. He was much more difficult in his dealings with leaders, European leaders like Angela Merkel, than he was in his dealings with authoritarians like Mohammed bin Salman or Erdogan, and especially Putin. I also focus quite a lot on the Russia relationship, and so certainly watching the way that the Trump administration handled the US-Russia relationship was really difficult. We had a president who refused to criticize the Putin regime. It was a terribly inconsistent policy, if you could even call it a policy. There were, of course, a huge cadre in the US government that were trying to do the right things. And, you know, of course, Congress passed a huge number of sanctions on Russia. We provided lethal aid to Ukraine. So there was a whole cadre within the US government that was taking important actions against the Kremlin. But obviously the president's own posture seriously undermined the deterrent effect of any of those actions. So I mean, I feel like I could go, maybe this is like a therapy session, and I could go on and on and on and talk about all of the difficulties, but it was very difficult to watch it from the sideline. And so I'd say in the think tank community, and for me personally, it forced us all to rethink the way that we were going to do our work in the think tank community. And it made us think very hard about the role that we could play from the outside in keeping the transatlantic community afloat, as the ambassador said. And so in my think tank, you know, we had done some programs like this Across the Pond in the Field, where we were going outside of Washington, DC, to try to engage with Americans on these issues, to have discussions. And we also worked very hard, you know, a key part of that was bringing Europeans along with us. We tried very hard to collaborate and engage with our European colleagues in order to kind of tend to the fabric of that relationship, and also to continue to communicate that I think many of the messages that were coming out of the White House are not widely shared within the foreign policy community and with large swaths of Americans. And so when you look at things like public polling, public opinion, public support for things like NATO and for the importance of allies remained extremely strong throughout that period. Some issues, like I think the president's kind of continued harping on burden sharing, does resonate with some Americans. But I think by and large, it was not strong public support for many of the things that the president said and some of his actions. And so it was a difficult period. Many people on the outside tried to kind of play their role and continue to mend and tend to relationships and continue to have important discussions and communicate that the foundation of the relationship was still strong and intact. And so now that brings us up to the current period, I think, where we do now have an opportunity to restore the transatlantic partnership. I know that there was kind of allies and partners have been excited about the outcome of the election, but we also recognize that we're not going to snap back to the way it was 4 years ago. I think in the United States, we recognize too that, trust, people say regularly, trust is one of those things that it takes a very long time to build up and that it can be lost in an instant. And so, we're not out of the woods yet. And so we can talk about where we go next, but it was a difficult 4 years. We now have an opportunity, I think, to try to restore and repair some of the damage that has been done in the relationship. And I think there's a lot of kind of pragmatic areas where we can work towards and move out on to take small steps towards that end, because I do think at the end of the day, regardless of what we saw coming out of the White House, there is still strong support in the United States and certainly in the national security community for the importance of allies and especially for the transatlantic relationship.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I'm really happy to hear that, and I can indeed imagine what for you personally that this must have been a difficult period. But let me turn to Ambassador Wouters, because he has basically been our ambassador, Belgian ambassador to the United States from 2016 until the beginning of September last year. So basically you have had most of the transition, first of all, from Obama to Trump, and then the Trump era, almost until the very end. So how did you, Ambassador, experience that period, especially from a transatlantic perspective?
Yeah. So thank you, Professor. Now, I'm not going to say that it was easy, and it's clear that on such a question, there's enough material to fill a full conference. But I will start maybe with something I think of almost every day. That was the inauguration speech in January 2017 of the incoming president, and we were there with the diplomatic corps, and the reaction among colleagues who were really thinking, what does this mean, was, well, two things. First, from now on, nothing will become impossible, and that was really something new on the domestic field or in the foreign policy. And second, and of course, most of us I'm myself a career diplomat, and most of us were career diplomats, not all of them, but we were saying, well, this may be the end of our business as career diplomats. Diplomacy will take a hit, and I'm mentioning diplomacy for two reasons, because I had experienced the end of the Obama administration, if I may say, and when I arrived in September 2016, what struck me at the time was the intensity of the dialogue that was going on in the most professional way on international issues. At the time it was climate, Iran, and Cuba, and that rather professional way of communicating between allies and countries, that kind of disappeared, at least at the highest level. And the second reason why I mention this is because it's very clear with the new administration and with all the professionals that have been brought back into this administration in Washington. I mean, diplomacy will come back and is already back. I mean, I think that's important to mention. Now, I was in the first place responsible for the bilateral relationship. We came out, I think, rather unscathed, but a smaller country in that kind of environment can try to stay under the radar and do other things. What we did was intensify, develop, strengthen the economic and trade and investment relationship, trying to find new friends in the country. We have this tendency in Europe to look at the United States as one city, Washington, as a country, but it's a continent, of course. We have to look more as a continent with different states that are really different, as you said in your introduction. And so we made many new friends in the business community in the different states, governors level, the local communities, and that was rather a rewarding experience. And it was possible, as Andrea indicated, to continue to talk, negotiate, as long as it wasn't, it didn't get really too much the attention at the highest level, and then maybe having the risk that your negotiation might fail. We also did a bit more parliamentary diplomacy, reaching out to, of course, to Congress. But when it comes to the EU-US relationship, that's a different story, because looking back and towards the end of my mandate, quite honestly, there was probably no policy on which we agreed anymore. I mean, there was disagreement on a large number of policies. I mean, of course, there was climate. I mean, the withdrawal from Paris was mainly a political issue between the European Union, let's say, and the administration, more than between the European Union and the country. Because when you traveled in the country, you met governors, mayors, business, who were all convinced by the scientific evidence and willing to take up the challenge of climate change, be it in California with the fires, in the Midwest with the storms, or in the South with the floods. I mean, that was very clear when you try to know the country better. On then defense, Andrea mentioned defense, the defense expenditure. That was also somewhat an experience. And although some good things happened in terms of increasing defense spending in Europe, we could not go all the way to the 2%. There are ways to respond to that, to the 2% issue, but the way it was handled and managed and approached. Then Iran, that was also a particular experience I found, because the imposition of sanctions with extraterritorial effects affecting the European businesses kind of sucked out the oxygen that Europe needed in order to try to save the Iran nuclear deal. And so that begged a big question about the sovereignty of your foreign policy position on the Iran in Europe on the Iran nuclear deal. Because if the position was to save the deal, but you were not allowed to do it because you were confronted with extraterritorial sanctions, that was a big, that was a new experience to me in terms of sovereignty of your foreign policy. And then, of course, there were these trade issues. But the worst, probably the worst, there was the attack on the European Union. That was new for me, and of course, that had to do with the attitude, or the more general attitude, towards international organizations during the Trump administration, which were seen overall, especially when China was a member of that international organization, as entities that try to limit the sovereignty of the United States and so. But the fact that I heard too often in the administration and increasingly that the European Union was a bad idea and that you were better off as separate countries, like the Brits were trying to do, that was a special experience. On NATO, I knew what was happening in the White House. I mean, there was one attempt, I think, that when the president really tried to get out of NATO, and we owe it to his then chief of staff, General Kelly, that it didn't. That was the former Home Secretary. Didn't happen. So, but there was a real attempt in the White House, and that was also not a very pleasant experience, I must say, for a diplomat.
Wow. Okay. I'm sure that all of the details about these 4 years that still will have to emerge will continue to fascinate us for many, many years. But so indeed, yeah, thank you for sharing that experience with us, Ambassador Wouters. Now, let's look at the future. We are now under the Biden administration. As I've said, we see quick developments in the relationship between the US and the European Union. And okay, well, what are the prospects? What are the perspectives today with the new US administration and the current EU leadership? I'm going to maybe ask Andrea to talk about that from an American perspective, and then come back to Ambassador Wouters, if I may. Andrea?
Great. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of optimism on this side of the Atlantic. And again, to go back to that point, though, about recognizing there will be more humility at this point, but I think that there's a lot of optimism about an excitement and intent to restore and renew the relationships in the transatlantic relationship. And so, and I think from the Biden team's perspective, I mean, this was an early priority. They wanted, and there was an effort to tackle some of the low-hanging fruit that was the kind of irritants in the relationship. And I think there has been an expectation that as they rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, as they have signaled their intent to rejoin the JCPOA if Iran returns to compliance, as they rejoin the World Health Organization and their intent to rejoin the Human Rights Council and tackling some of these, you know, the Boeing Airbus, some of these early trade irritants. I think there is a sense that that needed to be done in order to generate some momentum and signal goodwill. And again, was about generating momentum to get back on track in the transatlantic relationship, recognizing just how important that relationship is in American foreign policy. I do think that this administration, there is a very genuine and deeply held belief in the importance of allies, and you could see that in President Biden's speech at the Munich Security Conference, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's comments at NATO, and certainly with Tony Blinken's first foreign policy speech, the central role that allies play in their thinking about US foreign policy, that they view allies as force multipliers and really a unique asset that the United States holds. So I think there still is a lot of optimism, but I think now we're slowly running into the reality that things might be a little more difficult perhaps than the administration thought to get going. And certainly the Europe signing of the investment agreement with China, for example, was an early kind of warning about just how difficult it might be to get things back on track. And so I think what we can expect coming down the pike in terms of where the Biden administration wants to go, I do think that China will be front and center of the Biden's transatlantic agenda. There are certainly a number of issues too, and there is a desire to tackle the full range of issues. And so perhaps we might see them moving to create or establish a comprehensive dialogue that would allow the opportunity to talk with Europe on the full menu of options that are in front of us. But I think that China is front and center of all of that. And so, I don't know, I guess I can leave it there to see what Ambassador Wouters has, because I think we are at this very interesting place. You know, people on this side of Washington have certainly honed in on that idea of strategic autonomy, and there's real concerns about, you know, that might mean that Europe is a less good partner than it used to be, that it means perhaps that there is movement towards equidistance in Europe between the United States and China. So, you know, and I think that the reality is perhaps sinking in. And I think this was your comment earlier, Professor, about long-term concerns about where America is headed, that Europe doesn't necessarily see the United States as a reliable partner, and that they're taking steps to build up their own capabilities and autonomy to be able to address these geopolitical challenges. And so even though there was I think a hope with the Biden administration to say like, hey guys, we're back and we can now get back to business, that some of the reality is sinking in, and a recognition that perhaps, you know, this is about more than President Trump, and that some of these issues are going to be more difficult to tackle than I think perhaps the administration expected. But again, I think in terms of where we head, I do think that the China challenge is going to be front and center of that agenda. And we also saw, I think, Tony Blinken in his speech too, talking about the kind of, what that engagement might look like in the importance of the European Union. So whereas the previous administration under Trump was not about multilateralism, this administration, I think, is looking to elevate the role of the EU in the transatlantic relationship so that it's not just a NATO thing. There's a kind of a recognition now that the United States will have to engage with Europe on multiple levels. It's NATO, it's the EU, and it's also member states, recognizing that things like investment screening mechanisms and other like implementations of the things that we're looking to do vis-a-vis China then happen in member state capitals. So I think it'll be a multi-pronged approach. There's still a lot of energy to engage on these very important issues, but the reality, I think, is sinking in. And I think some early concerns about what we will be able to accomplish in the coming years.
Thank you so much. I can tell you, dear speakers, that in the meantime, I'm being stalked with lots of questions from our participants. So it's we should soon go to that more interactive part. And lots of those questions indeed also have to do with, say, the European situation, the European leadership. The question also to what extent Europe is really ready to go for more autonomy with regard to security and defense matters. President Macron has been talking about strategic autonomy and so on and so forth. So, Ambassador Wouters, could you share with us briefly a European perspective on the prospect for, say, cooperation with the current US administration? Thank you.
Well, overall, and there I join certainly Andrea, there is great hope and also relief in a certain way. And all the initial announcements have been about America being back and so on, and partners of first resort have all been confirmed in the initial speeches and documents that Andrea referred to, but also I would say in the already very long list, I must say, of early decisions, the low-hanging fruit decisions, which is already a very impressive list, I must say. Particularly welcomed, I think, in Europe is the stress on the importance of alliances around the world. I think there are more than 50 alliances that the United States has to undertake, but we know in Europe that the one in Europe gets a kind of VIP status in this new stress on rebuilding alliance, and which also opens the hope that at the first opportunity within NATO, maybe there can be some repetition of confirmation of commitments that are symbolically important in that context. As I think that also it's not just the alliances, the return to alliances that have been welcomed in particular, but also the return to international organizations. Why? Because there was a feeling in European diplomacy and all the European actors in these international organizations that they were kind of a bit alone during a period. They stood alone. They were keeping on the light, but waiting for the United States to come back. I think that's important. World Health Organization, the announcement by the United States that it will introduce its candidate for the Human Rights Council and the World Trade Organization. I mean, that's particularly welcomed, I would say, in Europe. There's also, of course, as the Zoom meetings, we all know, have their limitations, a hope of physical meeting with Joe Biden and that European leaders can hug him. As we know, I mean, so that symbolically there is something within the European Union. There is a hope also that there might be once again a summit maybe between the United States and the European Union. if I'm not mistaken, the last one goes back to 2014, and so that's also on the. There is a proposed. I mean, the European Commission and the High Representative for Foreign Policy, they have together proposed a new agenda, EU-US agenda for global change, and of course, it's an interesting agenda, but it has to be now fleshed out, made operational in the coming weeks, and also during that work, it will be interesting to see on which points there will be requests. There will be the famous asks to the transatlantic partner, and the same exercise will be is going on, or will be going on, of course, in Washington, when the interagency, once everybody is in position, will have to flesh out policies and positions on the US side. And then, of course, it's only on that basis, and from that moment, I think that we can start to identify what is the real sense of common purpose, what will be the issues, for example, on foreign policy, where you see the real opportunities. And of course, knowing with the caveat that once you, in the US, you've made your decision, it's not always easy to find margins for negotiation afterwards, but the same is true with the complex system in the European Union. We sometimes do not see our own limits in the European Union. I think when our leaders go to a summit, the President of the European Council, the President of the European Commission, that they don't have a lot, they have a big margin of maneuver to negotiate and become a bit more transactional, where I think there will be a need to become a bit more transactional, certainly on the European side. So I end my remarks with some striking features. I mean, something that has struck our mind in Europe is the focus that today is being put on the links between foreign policy or domestic policy and foreign policy, particularly in Antony Blinken's speech. I think he started even by saying, as a Secretary of State, my fellow Americans, and so there was a very strong link, meaning that domestic policy will also be analyzed through the prism of the consequences in the world, and vice versa. So also foreign policies will be probably more analyzed in the future and through the prism of its consequences for the middle class, or for certain situations within the United States, even if it's so-called foreign policy. So that's and why is that important? Because I guess it helps to regain some domestic strength for your diplomatic action abroad. So it is pretty important. But I think the same is true in the European Union. We will see the same, I think, trend coming up in the coming years, that we will also intensify the link between domestic policy and foreign policy. Now, two elements in public opinion to close my remarks, which are worth mentioning, I think, but public opinion in Europe, not leadership in Europe. That's important to make the decision. On the one hand, the Europeans witness a new president in the United States who favors alliances, supports the European Union, maybe even more than happened under President Clinton or President Obama. So we see that. That's not a small thing, and people realize that. But at the same time, the European public opinion is not sure that the line that will be set out by this administration and by President Biden will be continued afterwards. And so and there, of course, there is a question mark which also is related, of course, to the fact that we are in an ever-changing world. Demography is changing. I mean, technology is advancing. Our democracy is affected, and so on. But an ever-changing world to which we have to adapt. But at the same time, so there is this question mark: will the line, the new American line, be continued? And the second question that is asked, and I found also interesting in public opinion polls I've seen, is that the role of the US in the world question is different today in Europe. Used to be, well, the United States is maybe too strong, it's okay, it's deciding without consulting, or it's taking too much distance from a certain issue of concern to the Europeans. But today, the question mark in public opinion is whether the United States will be able to put itself again in a position of strength. So will it be able to take up leadership in our Western world? So I think that's a change in the way public opinion is thinking about the United States. Not the leadership. I think the leadership in Europe is very clear in embracing the new administration and also both in the institutions and in the member states, with probably France and Germany as the most consequential partners for the new US president. But it will be interesting to see how the new Italian prime minister will come into that game, because it's clear that in the European Union, if he stays prime minister, he will want Italy also to play an important role in the concert of European leaders. So
Can I just, I thought, so I'm sorry, you go ahead and finish. I was going to just pick up on your point about this concern about the unpredictability of American foreign policy and tie it to your comments about Secretary of State Blinken's address to the American people. And I think, you know, one thing that the election and the election of President Trump made foreign policy officials, national security practitioners very aware of is the disconnect between the making of foreign policy and the rest of the American public. And so that's something that I think this administration has taken on board. And so Secretary Blinken is addressing the American people, and I think trying to break down the silos between domestic and foreign policy as a way of building more American support and consensus about what the pillars of American foreign policy should be. So I think that it's a really interesting thing. I think everyone recognizes there's probably concerns about United States swinging from one extreme to the next in its foreign policy. And so there has to be greater outreach to the American public to build the kind of consensus and support and explain why these policies are good for the American people in order to try to, I think, provide a little, to anchor that policy in public opinion. So I think those concerns have been heard in Washington, and that's a large part of what that approach is about.
Thank you. In fact, I mean, I think it's high time we turn to our participants, because there are so many interesting questions that they raised. Let me just already come back to a question raised by Paul Carpentier, who is a founder of Twintac NV, a very prominent Belgian business company, and who points to the rather confusing fact that in America you currently have a bit of a kind of a divide between, let's say, roughly 50% who is saying America first and 50% who is saying America is back and wants to assert global leadership. And, you know, how do we build a really long-term relationship framework in such a kind of climate? It's very difficult to let's say have a so-called relational stability if there is such a division in a particular country. What advice? I mean, you already addressed it by pointing to the speech by Blinken, but between a speech and really making sure that this divide can in a way be solved, there's a very big gap. So Andrea, what do you think about this? How to address that?
Yeah, so I think, you know, there will be a big case that this administration tries to make. I'm sure everyone has heard the saying that America first does not mean America alone. And so trying to reach out to the other, you know, 50% of Americans that more wholeheartedly adhere to this idea of America first. I mean, I guess I just go back and, you know, to this idea about the importance of public opinion and the ability of our foreign policy and national security experts to continue to make the case to Americans about why certain approaches are in the US, you know, the best interest of Americans. And so, like, as Ambassador Wouters was saying, you know, there will be more of a lens of the domestic population in our foreign policy to try to link foreign policy decisions to why it matters for everyday Americans. I think that has largely been lost. And so, you know, for the last for a very long time, our foreign policy officials haven't really done that. And when we've gone outside of Washington, D.C. on some of these across the pond trips, one of the things we hear overwhelmingly is that Americans do crave, they do want a clear vision of what American foreign policy is and why it matters for people in Milwaukee or Boise or Tampa. Why does it matter to everyday Americans? So that will be, I think, an important lens. And I think we are likely to see this administration in multiple different ways and in multiple different venues making a case to the American people about a certain foreign policy course and explaining why it matters to Americans. I think you might also see, you know, one of the things I've also heard is this is also top of mind in the US Congress. And so talking to some colleagues there might be also efforts to try and use legislation, for example, changing some of the legislation on what it takes for a US president to withdraw the United States from NATO. Since that was something that had to be approved by Congress to go in there, I think they are thinking about and debating new legislation that would require congressional approval to pull America out of NATO. And so in these ways, trying to signal to Europeans that some of these fundamental principles of US foreign policy are longstanding and consistent, and to try to alleviate at least some of those concerns. But I think in my mind, just to wrap up, is it really is about making the case to American people to try to build up public support for some of these key pillars of US foreign policy.
Yes, that's clearly the case, although you wonder, of course, to what extent you reach really the people on the ground. The media landscape has also evolved tremendously in the United States. How do you really, how are you able in such a kind of new media landscape to reach out to everybody? And then, of course, also like, when you say, in a way, curtailing through federal legislation, presidential executive powers is, of course, a tricky thing. What you say, would it apply also to a possible withdrawal from the World Trade Organization, from other international organizations like we had the WHO? Would it also apply to dropping out of certain treaty alliances, such as the Paris Agreement or other international treaties like the Iran deal that President Trump withdrew from? So these are very interesting things, in fact, which we should also compare with our America-Europe Fund in a European perspective, because in Europe too, we have all kinds of EU-based agreements with third countries, and we face similar questions about who has the final word with regard to the fate of an international agreement. And I'm sure the European Parliament in that respect has some of its own thinking compared to, for instance, the Council of Ministers. If I may, Ambassador Wouters, I would like to come back to you with a question that was asked by exactly a policy analyst at the European Parliament, Gisela Grieger, who asks us how realistic are the prospects for the European Union to cooperate more assertively with the Biden administration on flashpoints such as the East China Sea, the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, to defend the rules-based order, in this particular case, the fundamental rules on the law of the sea that we know are laid down in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, against cases of Chinese coercion. How realistic are the prospects for a really, let's say, effectively cooperative attitude of the European Union on such matters? Please, Ambassador.
Well, was the question whether we can cooperate with the United States or we can have a common position in the European Union? Because that was not very clear to me in the question.
I think, in a way, I don't want to reinterpret our, say, Gisela's question, but I think the question is, in the first place, can we Europeans make up our minds? And maybe not just in terms of foreign policy terms, in aligning with the Americans, but maybe also a little bit in terms of operational capacity on certain matters of security. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. No, I understand it. Thank you very much, Professor. Now, of course, there's a lot of homework within the European Union in order to be taken seriously by our partners, in the first place, the United States, and that will only happen if we take ourselves seriously and we present ourselves as a united team. Now, I think that the number of issues around the world on which we can agree on common positions has increased. We should not forget that practically every month the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the member states of the European Union, they meet in the Council, and the only thing they do is see whether they can agree on common positions. So that's their core business. And so, of course, the specific issue of the South China, well, it's a specific issue, of course, the South China Sea, and probably Andrea knows more about it. I think that as long as it is on getting solutions based on rules, there's probably a better chance to get agreement within the European Union than, and probably also with the United States. Now, when it comes to mobilizing capabilities of a military or defense nature for that part of the world, I mean, let's not forget that for the European Union, the priority probably in terms of the crisis around the world is to first of all try to stabilize its own neighborhood and to expand the stability that the member states have created on their own continent, to expand that to their immediate neighborhood. I think that's a priority, and I think that the military or the tools that are at disposal should be used in the first place for that purpose, rather than for the purpose of going that far for rather, I mean, a very specific issue. Can I come back, Jan, 1 second on the previous question, which was very interesting, because how can you build a relationship, as the Paul Carpenter asked, if your partner is divided? I mean, let me say that having lived long enough in the United States to know that, I mean, division has a long and very complex history, so it's nothing new. Second, you don't build a relationship on the basis of fear, be it fear from an external partner, or be it fear of division within the country or that your partner of your partner. So, and third, if you look at what I see as priorities and opportunities for the United States and Europe to work together in the coming months, controlling the pandemic. Why? Because you need to control the pandemic before you can re-engage the economy, relaunch the economy. So these are two common challenges within the European Union, United States, and within the transatlantic community, both of them. But also the third, on my list at least, which is climate. And I don't think that on these three issues, the fact that, let's say, there is the new president, but still 50% of the electorate has or had another preference, will affect that much the management of these three issues. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Well, again, I have a couple of other questions which I would like to address. And one of the questions is by a person who has been at many of our seminars, a nice colleague called Wolfgang Pape, who basically asked the question, and I would like to bring it to Andrea. Will the United States accept more autonomy of the European Union, especially in the whole security and defense. Just assuming we get our act together to basically further build a common security and defense policy, which hopefully will bring us a little bit beyond being just a regional stabilizing force in the world and hopefully contribute to something more of other global security issues. But will the US accept that a stronger autonomy of the EU, or will the US mainly continue to look at NATO? Andrea.
Well, my hope is that the answer is yes. And I do think that, knowing some of my colleagues that have gone into the Biden administration, that there is a much more positive orientation on this debate on European strategic autonomy, that there are more people in this Biden administration that view a strong and capable Europe as being also in the interest of the United States. And so I think this is especially relevant when we're thinking about, the China challenge. And as all of the statements coming out of the Biden administration have indicated that China is a significant challenge, even above and beyond Russia and some of these other challenges. And in that framework, it will be really important that the Europeans can do more to provide for their own security and defense, to take on more of the burden sharing and addressing and deterring the challenge in Russia, coming from Russia, so that the United States has more resources and capabilities that it can free up to address this much more significant long-term challenge stemming from Russia. So I do think that there will be a more open-mindedness and more willingness to support and not actively obstruct some of Europe's efforts to build its capabilities. Thinking about the European Defense Fund and other things. And so far in PESCO projects in particular, the United States has kind of been obstructionist in many ways. And I am hopeful as some of that gets worked out, and we do see now some third-party participation in these projects, that there will be greater support for that, as long as, and as people always emphasize, it's not redundant and duplicative of what NATO is doing. So I guess, just to boil down that answer, I think that we will see more willingness to accept that, more to be done to encourage it, because it will be very important in this long-term China challenge that Europe is a more capable partner, and recognizing that we're stronger when we are together on all of these fronts, and ultimately that is a good thing for the United States.
We are not far away from the end of this fascinating webinar, but Ambassador, I really would like to pick up on that issue and come back to you, because let me ask you a very provocative question. Does Europe really have even the ability, the capacity to think geopolitically? It's really a question that was asked to us by one of our participants from Romania, but to be honest, and Andrea was referring to that, recently we had this deal with China about the so-called comprehensive agreement on investment, and I'm sure that deal must not have been welcomed very enthusiastically in the United States and even in Europe. There are many commentaries who say, well, we sold ourselves out much too cheaply. We didn't get any firm guarantees by China with regard to strengthening labor rights, ratifying important ILO conventions, and so on and so forth. Are we still not a little bit the naive Europeans, or are we really developing our own geopolitical capacity? Ambassador.
Well, my answer, to this question is more no than yes, but we should probably. There's no tradition in the European Union to think in geopolitical terms and to kind of feed our foreign policy analysis with the kind of intelligence information that you may need in order to become more geopolitical. And of course, there remains a huge difference between the way the United States is trying to inform before taking foreign policy decisions with the way we do it in the European Union. We know the importance of intelligence, of course. That's not a question, but we are not organized as yet in that way. But of course, geopolitics has made his re-entry in the world, and we are now faced with countries that have a completely different idea, a vision of the agenda for the world, the international agenda. And so we have to, as long as we say that the multilateral approach is the cardinal principle for the European Union to organize international and organize and manage international relations, and we are confronted with new actors that challenge the way we see the international agenda and the rule-based order, then we probably have an interest to push back, to realign with the United States in these international organizations, provided that it works for the Atlantic Partnership. So the international organization must come up with output that is beneficial for all of us, including the United States. Have been all, so that's very important. But so we may have an interest, but we are certainly not yet there, and there is no tradition in the European Union. The first security strategy of the European Union worked out under High Representative Javier Solana, the former NATO Secretary General, and to which I contributed. I was in the kind of, the inner circle of Solana to write. It was obvious that it was rather multilateralism, so international cooperation and taking up responsibility, which are much better words for multilateralism, by the way. That was the cardinal principle of the security strategy. Not any geopolitical concept.
Okay, thank you. We have to more or less come to a close, but allow me please to just ask each of you a final question, hopefully also allowing you to round up and to pass your final message, if you wish, to our audience. First of all, to Andrea. Andrea, may I kindly ask you, what are your expectations with regard to the alliance of democracies that President Biden has referred to as a possible, let's say, way of working together, especially, I would say, also on issues relating to China? Please.
Yes. So I think there will be. I think it's clear when we're thinking of countries like China and Russia, and in the United States foreign policy vision, that this administration views things largely through an ideological lens. I mean, President Biden has kind of repeatedly said that this is a competition between systems, and democracies have to demonstrate that they can outperform authoritarian systems. And so this is going to be a continued significant emphasis that's coming out of this administration. And certainly when seen that way, cooperation and coordination with European allies and partners is fundamental to the success of US foreign policy. And that is why I think there is such a focus coming from this administration on strengthening allies. But one thing I think that will be important to think about is also that it's the transatlantic relationship, but that we also have to reach out to allies in the Indo-Pacific as well. And so, there was that question about how Europe can be engaging in the Indo-Pacific. Maybe it is that NATO creates an Indo-Pacific Council, where if it's not a physical presence, that at least there's opportunities for engagement and collaboration, and certainly a learning and sharing of best practices. These are countries that are on the front lines of China's aggressive kind of sharp power, as many in the United States call it. And so the transatlantic relationship is an important anchor of that, but also working through a broader coalition of like-minded countries, I think is going to be increasingly important in the years to come. And I guess just as a final word, I do think that this is a tremendous opportunity to restore and renew and revitalize the transatlantic relationship, that there is a tremendous amount of work to be done. We didn't even, I think, in this period talk at all about the challenges coming from Russia, which, it's worth noting, the first couple of weeks of the Biden administration were really dominated by Russia, extending the New START, giving this intelligence community tasking on solar winds, on election interference, on Navalny. So there is a huge there is no shortage of work to be done in the transatlantic relationship. And so I do hope that both sides can come together. It's the shared history and shared values that we talked about, but we have such a convergence of interests on some really important areas. And so I do hope that both sides are genuine in their efforts to kind of get this momentum and cooperation off the ground, because doing so is going to be really fundamental in taking on and competing with adversaries for us, in particular in the United States, but also that pose this threat to our shared way of life, Russia and China. We're going to have to do that together to be effective.
Thank you so much. Now, Ambassador Wouters, I still have a bit of a, let's say, tricky question for you. You spoke about the EU's commitment to multilateralism, and we all know that. It's been very clearly spelled out in the 2003 security strategy. It's spelled out clearly in the 2016 global strategy, and it's spelled out very clearly in a very recent joint communication from the 17th of February of this year that indeed again underscores the EU's commitment to the rules-based multilateral system. This being said, the EU remains a strange animal in international relations, especially when we talk about the United Nations. And in the United Nations, we do have now, let's say, new attempts at reforming, at modernizing, at making the UN much more, let's say, networked and legitimate and stakeholder-oriented. It's the work that the current Secretary General, Gutierrez, is basically doing on behalf of the General Assembly. And I wonder, but it's a question I would like to ask to you, what contribution should the EU make to United Nations reform, including even the Security Council, a very hard nut to crack? And do you believe indeed that we now have a kind of small window of opportunity with the Biden administration to make also reform of the United Nations a possibility within the next 3 years? Please, Ambassador.
That's indeed a very tricky question. I guess that the United Nations will get more attention in Washington and even up to the level of the new president. If I remember correctly, but please, Andrea, do correct me. For example, President Biden, it's not, of course, the answer to a question, Professor, but President Biden in 1999 was co-authoring in the Senate, I think, with Senator Helms, a compromise to resolve a long outstanding question of arrears to the regular UN budget. So he knows what it means, at least in terms of financially supporting the United Nations. My understanding is that today there is again talk about paying some of the arrears, which is, I think, for the UN Secretary General, not a small thing if that would happen, because it would be a sign of support to the United Nations. The support of the European Union, of course, is long-standing, and they are already actively involved in the famous, what's it called, 75 or UN.75 exercise by the Secretary General. I think the European Union will reach out to the United States in order to make the two big UN global conferences of this year, the one on climate in Glasgow, I think, and the one on biodiversity in China, by the way, I mean the conference of the parties, to make a success. And it's important, I think the climate one is important because there is this hope that also the Biden administration will eventually join the ambitious target of carbon neutrality by 2050. But of course, it's not just a regional transatlantic issue. It has to be a global issue because also China, of course, has to contribute to the kind of sacrifices and efforts that are asked. On the Security Council, Professor Wouters, I have really my doubts that there is a lot of space for the European Union to get a place. I think it's I see much more mileage in cooperation among European members, be that permanent or non-permanent, in the coming years. It has worked a bit better lately, one has to say. But the challenge is not so much Europe in the Security Council. The challenge is the position of China and the position of Russia towards the Security Council, the UN system, and the global agenda, and the multilateral approach that we favor. I mean, I sometimes use the phrase that while the Europeans are trying to promote the multilateral approach, the Chinese are trying to use it for their own purpose and to change the agenda. And we've seen what that means in technical organizations such as intellectual property in Geneva, or the World Health Organization, where Chinese have unfortunately filled some of the vacuum that was left there. So we have that experience. And then the Russia, who is trying more to block, not to instrumentalize, but not to cooperate, but to block the system. So we have, these are the real challenges, not so much, I think, presence of the European Union in the Security Council. So in conclusion, indeed, I would agree with those that it matters how the European Union will approach the challenge by Russia and by China. It matters for the transatlantic relationship.
Thank you so much. My dear, distinguished speakers, we have to come to a close here with our webinar. I would like to thank you both very cordially, Andrea and Ambassador Wouters, for your sharing your great expertise and insights with us. It is clear that this is just the beginning of a conversation, of course, and that we will very gratefully build on that in the next editions of this transatlantic lecture series, the next one of which, as I said, is already scheduled within 2 weeks' time from now. On the 23rd of March, we will have the privilege of welcoming Professor Chad Bown from the Peterson Institute and Professor Christoph Krombe from Stanford University and from KU Leuven, who will discuss the opportunities for cooperation between the US and the EU with regard to trade matters, both bilateral and multilateral within the context of the World Trade Organization. But there will be other sessions as well that hopefully should enable us to elaborate some of the very important remarks you have made regarding China, regarding Russia, regarding security, regarding climate. And I'm happy also to indicate that there will also be a specific session with regard to innovation, which is also one of the very important places where I think the US and the Europeans can work together. So thank you so much. Deeply grateful for your contribution to the debate. I'm sure our audience was also extremely appreciative of that. And we hope to see you all back in 2 weeks' time when we have our second high-level transatlantic lecture on US-EU perspectives for cooperation on trade matters. Thank you very much. And I would say have a good afternoon in, the United States, and a very good evening on the European side. And thank you very much also to our great audience. We hope to see you back very soon. Bye.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Hey, Andrea.